Isaac and this idea that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his beloved child. What's behind that? Why is this story in our scripture? Why is it something that's been foundational to three major religions in our world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? You'll find that this story is critical to all three of the Abrahamic faiths and our understanding of what it means to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have a love-hate relationship with this story. A love part because, and I'll geek out briefly for a moment. I was so excited to tell Maggie Kinney this week at Bible study on Thursday. I really got to geek out. My master's thesis for my divinity degree was in this part of the Bible, and I got to study Hebrew and all the special little words behind this story and like the development from the God of Abraham to this monotheistic religion. That's what my whole thesis paper was about. If anyone wants to read it, I'm so excited to talk to you about it. But that will not be the sermon today, so no worries. Maybe a TED Talk one day. The hate part is because I don't understand why is this story here? Why would God, this God that I envision and have been taught to believe is this God of unconditional love, this God who has made a promise to Abraham and Sarah, ask them something that's so horrendously cruel and incomprehensible to us? Why is that there? And what kind of God makes a promise to someone? A promise of land and descendants and relationship, and then fulfills that after years of agony of waiting for this beloved child that they have struggled for, and then asks them to give that child up. What kind of God tests Abraham at all? Is that what he's doing? Why is there even testing? What's going on in this story? For thousands of years, people have been wrestling with this story since its very formation. I spent the week immersed in the Jewish midrashes. The midrash are the commentaries of the Jewish theologians for the past 2,000 years. And then Christian theologians and how they could possibly wrestle with all of those questions and more that we might bring to this scripture text, coming out with different threads. And so from that, I'm going to try to grasp some of those threads and share the ones that for me are where my heart is and how I can understand this story and how it could possibly have meaning for us today. Because on the face of it, it's not a story that I'm okay with. And on the face of it, that's not the kind of God that I believe in. So a long time ago, and this kind of goes back to my master's thesis, in ancient Near Eastern history, back when Abraham was alive, which is around 1200 BCE, is usually, or before that, so it's like 2000 or 1200 BCE, so a long time ago, the ancient people had a variety of deities that they worshipped, kind of like when we think about the Native Americans today, and the variety of deities, or the Aztec or Mayan people that we may have studied in our history classes. And those deities required different types of sacrifices for different blessings that were offered. And one of them was human sacrifice. That's something that the Aztec people in South America also practiced a long, long time ago. And it was believed that if you had this sacrifice, you'd have a year or up to 7 years of excellent fertility for your crops and for your people. And so that was a part of it. It was this ancient religious practice. And so one of the threads that I pulled on thinking about this week is the fact that in Scripture, this story shows that God, the God of Abraham, is a different kind of deity that Abraham and Sarah worshiped in the midst of all of these deities in the land that they live in. That this is a God who ends up saying, no, you do not need to sacrifice for any reason for me, for you and I to be in relationship with one another. A God who ends up saying, I value human life, especially the life of children. And that sets God apart from the other deities of that time. That's one thread that's been lifted up for thousands of years. And it says something about the character of God. And I want to get back to that in a little bit. But also keep in mind those questions of what does it mean? Does God test us? Does God not test us? Is sacrifice something that is or isn't required of us? What does this story possibly mean? This week, as I wrestled with this story, I thought about the metaphorical altars of sacrifice that we do put ourselves, our loved ones, our neighbors, and even our children upon at times. The altar of consumerism, of sports, of having difficulty prioritizing what's important in our lives. The altars of addiction, of abuse, of neglect, and how they can impact our families, not only immediately, but for generations to come. And what does that mean for us? So while the sacrifice of Abraham's son seems like an anathema to us, we all at some point in our society have experienced anathemas, our sacrifices on these altars that just don't make sense. They seem incomprehensible or cruel. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot this year as the Super Bowl comes to the Twin Cities and that I've been asked to help participate in is the Super Bowl is the #1 sexually trafficked event in the United States every year. And then there's this organization that's been asking clergy to step up and learn the signs of that. So if we see someone who might exhibit certain signs, we can try to step in and intervene to help that young person. For me, that's an anathema. I don't understand that part of humanity. It seems so evil and cruel to me. I don't know how anyone can be a part of that. But we have our personal altars of sacrifice too. The ones that we struggle with our own sins, or those of society, like I just mentioned, or those of our families that can bear us down. My own family comes from a history of addiction. I would say addiction and neglect and abuse are the altar of sacrifice in which loved ones have been sacrificed in my own family. My grandmother grew up in a family in which her father was an alcoholic who hit her and her siblings regularly. And when she became a parent herself, while she no longer drank, she was not an addict herself, she continued that cycle of abuse. And my mom and her sister grew up in that. And they grew up with the parents whose love was conditional. They didn't ever hear the words, I love you. And nothing was ever good enough for my grandmother. Now my mom, she made a different choice in her parenting. That cycle did not continue to my sister and I. I did not grow up in an abusive family. I grew up in a home where there was unconditional love constantly. I never wondered about love, and we had healthy and good parenting boundaries. But that baggage continued. Because you see, while I know my mom unconditionally loved me, and I always had that from her, my mom could not trust that I, as her daughter, loved her because she had not experienced that in her own mother-daughter relationship. And I admit one of my fears now as I prepare for motherhood this fall is what baggage am I going to bring with me from this generational cycle into my own mother-daughter relationship? What is the altar that I need to be aware of so that I do not sacrifice my own child upon it? What are the altars of our own lives, and how do they affect us? And where is God in the midst of that? Is it a test? Is it a challenge? Is it a sign of faithfulness? what is it? Is it just a bunch of crap that we don't know what to do with? Which sometimes it is, so it is. Where is God? The scripture says that the Lord will provide. What does that mean for us? The story of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham, and we've come a long way, by the way. Last Sunday was the creation story, first chapter, and now we're in chapter 22 the next week. We've skipped a lot. We've gone from the creation story in which God created humanity in God's image and values life because of that, to a story in which we are having this wonderment about, is God's promise true? What is God? Does God actually test those who God has made in God's image? Within that, between those times, we've had this story of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham, who's considered the father of those three religions I mentioned earlier, he and Sarah have been through a lot before we get to this chapter. They have journeyed from home, following this promise from God of land, trusting in a promise of descendants and of relationship with God. It's a threefold promise: the land, descendants, and relationship. One that will play out through the entire Hebrew Bible and all of Abraham's story. They don't trust the promise. They struggle with it, just like we trust with believing and trusting in God's promises sometimes. They wonder if those promises are going to come true. They try, as we do with our own human nature, to figure out their own solutions to make God's promises come true when they want them to come true. They have difficulty trusting and waiting. One of the examples of that is their desire for a child in the years of infertility. And God continuously sending messengers, and Sarah and Abraham laughing, being like, that can't be true, that can't happen. And then Sarah sending her slave girl Hagar to have a child that they can have in their name. And the child is born, and his name is Ishmael. And right before this story, because of her jealousy and concern over her own son Isaac, who's finally been born, the son of promise after many years, she sends Hagar and Ishmael away because she doesn't want any inheritance issues. If you think your family has problems, just read the book of Genesis. Like, a lot of family conflict there. And so we have this story in which Abraham and Sarah have struggled for years to trust in God's promise, and you have the visible sign of the promise, Isaac. And God asks them to give up that visible sign. For me, when I read this story, I was amazed by something I'd never read in it before this week, which doesn't say very much about my scholarship, I guess, in seminary. Abraham trusts God for really the first time. The other times he always was wishy-washy or trying to figure out his own way. And this time he has complete trust that God will act in a way in which all will be well and the promise will be kept. The Bibles are back there, but Rick, could you go back to the scripture?
Genesis?
All right, next one. Next page. Next page. Thank you. Do you see in verse 5 it says, they leave behind his guard of men? Abraham was a very wealthy man, so he had his personal guard with him. We will come back to you. They leave behind the guard, and he and Isaac go off towards where the sacrifice will be. And he says to the men, we will come back to you. For Abraham, he doesn't see this necessarily as a test for himself, in my opinion. He trusts that God will provide in the way that God has always provided and kept the promise true for them. And then the story continues and they go forward. And indeed, the sacrifice of Isaac is stopped. It's like God saying, stop, 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 stop. Your faithfulness is true. But better than that, is it really a test of God or of Abraham? Is it Abraham or God's test? One of my favorite theologians is Eli Wiesel. He is a Jewish theologian who survived the Holocaust, and he wondered in his famous book, Night, which you may have read, in which where was God present in this horrible act of humanity against humanity that we had occur in the 1930s and 40s in our world. Eli says this scripture is not a test about Abraham, because God does not test God's people. It was a test about God to show us who our God is and how our God works in relationship to us. A test to show us that God is committed to the promises that God has made to be in relationship with us. A test of God's own character to say that I am faithful, I am here for you, that I am a God who values life. I am a God who does not need any sacrifice. I am not the kind of God who would ask you ever to harm another being in my name. It's a test about God, not for us. In the wake of the hurricanes that have gone on in the South, I've heard some of the conservative televangelists say that the hurricane was a sign of God's punishment. We always hear that every time there's a major disaster, right? Oh God, blah, blah, blah. God doesn't do that. This was God saying, I am here for you. I'm going to keep my promises. And as this situation comes to conclusion, God reiterates God's promise to Abraham and Sarah again, staying faithful and keeping steadfast to that promise of life. For me, that's so important, and I bring my Christology to that. As a Christian, my belief in Jesus Christ and God's promise of resurrection, of making something come out of even the worst situations, out of death, out of darkness, come true and have new being again. That God can do anything out of the worst situations, out of our own complications, out of the messiness of our own altars of sacrifice. That there is always hope and promise in the resurrection and in God's faithfulness to us and God's desire to be in relationship with us. And that doesn't require testing or sacrifice or any of that. So my family, I had briefly mentioned kind of the sacrifice of altar in my family history. My grandma doesn't believe she's lovable. My mom wants nothing more than to be loved by her own mother and to hear the words, I love you. And I, in that family situation, grew up with a mom for many years, particularly when I reached that teenage young adult phase, who couldn't believe that I did love her unconditionally. It was anathema to her because of her own past. My hope, my belief in God's faithfulness and resurrection in my own family is that just like Isaac was loosened from the bounds of sacrifice, that one day my grandma might believe she's lovable. My hope in God's resurrection is that one day my mom may be able to hear I love you from her mom. I doubt it's going to happen just knowing my grandma the way I do. But that she'll come to learn and accept what she can from that, and that our relationship can be healthy and whole as she receives my unconditional love. And that I and my daughter won't have to go through this time of testing in which I'm like, do you really love me? Do you really love me? Do you really love me? And I'll just be able to accept it and live into that relationship. That's my hope for each of us with our own altars of sacrifice. whatever yours may be, that you may trust that the God of resurrection, the God of steadfastness and faithfulness to you, will bring you freedom and new life. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.